Hey friend, welcome to Authentic Performance, the podcast. My name is Nat and I'm your host. At Authentic Performance, our mission is to provide education and advocacy for all athletes, developing awareness surrounding identity, purpose, and health, so athletes can live well beyond their sport. We're back this week with another solo episode, this time talking about core values. I first started thinking about my core values last year through an exercise I did in a class, and after knowing how much they affect my behavior and relationships, I'm so excited to chat more about what they mean for our lives. I hope that you leave this conversation feeling encouraged, maybe even more seen and heard, and with practical ways to start using your core values to elevate your life. Thanks for being here. I'm so excited. All right. Welcome back to another solo episode of the podcast. I'm super excited today to talk about values and the influence that they kind of have on our lives as athletes and then realistically just as people. So, if you've been following Authentic Performance for any amount of time, you probably know that one of the things that we really value is identity, and just kind of talking about what that means, especially in the context of athletics. Um, and so, with that, one of the biggest pieces is understanding what's important to us, who we are. Um, and so, I want to share a quote real quick from Brené Brown, and then we'll just kind of dive into what those values might look like for you and kind of how to use them. So Brené Brown has said that authenticity is the daily practice of letting go of who we think we're supposed to be and embracing who we are. So one of the biggest things with core values and just values in general is kind of separating between the things that we think we're expected to be and the things that actually really matter to us. And so I'll talk a little bit more about like when you take a core values assessment. But one of the biggest things that I encourage is that you really focus on what it means for you and not for anyone else. And truthfully, like if you're an athlete, this might be something that's kind of hard for you because I know for me, like a lot of my athletic career, I really loved playing sports, but I was also really encouraged to keep doing things because that was just part of what our family did, and I don't regret it at all. But um, you also can get stuck in that pattern of like, well, my parents have instilled this in me, which is not inherently bad, but it's really important to kind of separate that from who you really are and who you really want to be and what you want to do, because especially in sports, like if your heart's not really in it, it's going to be really hard to kind of navigate that that change, or just, I guess, focusing on what's really important and not trying to people please, which is, I think, a pretty common characteristic of athletes sometimes. So, just briefly, when we're talking about values, the big question is, who are you? And this is a really hard question. It's a hard question for anyone to answer, but I think especially when you're an athlete or you're really involved in one thing, it can be really easy to just solely identify as that thing and not understand any of the other aspects of your life. And one of the biggest dangers of doing that is that at some point it'll all come to an end. Not to sound like really uh, depressing or anything, but ultimately, like, our bodies can only handle so much, and so like you can't be a college athlete or even a professional athlete forever. So understanding like where those values lie and like the deeper meaning of what maybe even led you to athletics in general, is going to be really helpful for you at any point in life, but especially as you transition out of sport, or you kind of try to figure out what's next in whatever season you are, whether you're a high school athlete, college athlete. Maybe you haven't even really played sports, but you're just like, I don't really know who I am or what's important to me. It's just a practice of reflection that's not very common, but it is super valuable. And I know for me, it really changed my perspective about myself. So just to give you kind of a little bit of a definition of values, values are characteristics that are deeply important to who you are and how you interact with the world around you. So they're basically these principles that are going to guide your behavior, attitude, and decision making, whether you're in sport or out of sport. So um, those values, although they may shift a little bit and change over time, the core of them is probably going to stay pretty consistent, because it probably drives the way that you approach your sport or a job or a relationship. Whatever it is that you value is going to seep into all of those areas of life. Um, so then when we talk about core values, it's just a little bit more specific. Those are the values that are most important to you as an individual. They're going to have more of an influence on your behavior than other values. Um, it's not that you couldn't also value other things, but this process of like really identifying the most important ones, I think can be really helpful just in understanding maybe why you approach situations a certain way. And then also kind of navigating change can be really hard, but once you know what you value, that can be a little bit of an easier transition in figuring out things that kind of fit in those values. So specifically in sport, some things that might be impacted by what you value is your reaction to either a win or a loss, how you show up to train or practice, what your priorities are within your sport or outside of your sport, and also how you treat your coaches and teammates. So there's a lot of ways where these values can really come out either in a good way or a bad way. But knowing them is one of the keys to being able to kind of almost control those healthy or unhealthy outcomes that might come from that, deeply rooted thing that matters to you. So then when we talk about team values, this is kind of a little different aspect. These are the values that are most important to a team, which may influence the goals and prospects of the program as a whole. So if you're on a sports team, there's probably some values that maybe you've kind of set or your coaches have set. If you are on a team and you haven't kind of identified those values, I think it's a really valuable tool. Research has shown that once you have those values kind of in line, team cohesion is going to be better, and you almost have kind of a personality for your team. Where if you don't have those things clearly identified, it might be kind of hard to all come to the same consensus and make those goals. For example, if you're on a team that really values achievement, it might be kind of hard for people who don't value that to really buy into the program if they value other things. Like they might not be as dedicated to doing things to get the win. Maybe it's more for them, it's more about like one of their values is fun, like that, and those are completely valid values, which again, like, it's going to be very individual to you. But also building a team and understanding what those values are going to be, not that it's going to be everyone's number one value, but understanding where people stand together is going to help you to set those goals realistically for the whole team. So maybe someone whose number one goal is fun isn't going to want to be a part of a team that's number one goal is achievement, or maybe they just need to kind of change their approach a little bit, and find fun in the hard work. But that's going to be very like different for different people and programs and kind of what that looks like. But ultimately, like, you want to have a team that has some values that can work together, especially for like setting goals, which is another really awesome practice for teams specifically. But it's really hard to understand team values when we don't really talk about them, which is um, I think where a lot of people are at. Like, you don't really know what your values are because it's hard to just like reflect and think, oh, I think I value this or this, and not really understand how that maybe applies to your life. So one of the things that I've done with a couple different groups of athletes, and I've even like given this test to my friends, is a core values assessment. So it's not super difficult. It just gives you kind of a list of values and you just rank them. So you'll pick like your top 10, and then you'll narrow that down to 5, and then 3, and then 1, and then you'll define that number one value. So this is not like, I did not come up with this test. It's just something that is used a lot for like trying to understand those values. But I do have like a version that I've used and kind of adapted to fit, especially for athletes. So if you do want that test, you can DM our Instagram at Authentic Performance, or email me at authenticperformance.llc@gmail.com, and I will definitely send that over. I highly recommend you just take it and give it to other people, even if you don't really know what you're going to do with it. Like, it's a really good starting point. It can be a little overwhelming and stressful to try to pick only like 10 values, but the whole point is that once you get those values down, then you can kind of keep whittling it down a little bit and narrowing it to your number 1 or 3 values. And truthfully, like, when I say we're talking about identity, like, these values are not completely who you are, but they are going to have a really big impact on the way you approach the world. So if your number 1 value like is family, that doesn't mean that that's all that you are, that you are only focused on family and that's the only thing that matters. And if you don't, have a family of your own, that like then you have nothing, and who you are is completely out the window. Like, these things are just going to impact the way that we live. So um you are not your number 1 value, but it will have a really big impact on your life. So just some other things about like this test specifically. I do encourage athletes to define that number 1 value, because it's going to look different for everyone, and that's completely okay. One person who maybe has a core value, number 1 value of family, may have a completely different definition of family than someone else. Maybe one person is like, it's having a really strong bond with the people that I'm closely related to. Someone else, it might be just like people that have come into their life that have no, direct relation to them, but have, become really good friends, and it's like a community. Like, that definition is going to be really important for you to understand. So you just kind of know what that value even means. And if you really want to dive more into what those other values mean to you, you could also just like define those, because that's going to give you a little deeper understanding of yourself personally and what that value actually means to you, because one word can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. And so then we do 10 values, and then narrow it down to 5 and 3 and 1. But just in general, people have found that your top 10 values will stay pretty consistent over your life. But the order is probably going to change depending on what season you're in, which makes a lot of sense. If you are going through a season where one value just kind of is more prominent, then it might kind of change and be higher up in importance. But typically, those values, the group of values that you have for your 10 is going to stay pretty consistent, because it's pretty core to who you are, and just like how you've maybe grown, or experiences you've been through. And I do want to mention too, like, one of the things I try to encourage people the most about when taking this test is that, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't about what your parents value. It's not about what your siblings value. It's not about anyone else but you, because there's no wrong answer. Like, it's not, these values are not ranked in any other way other than your ranking of them personally. There's not one that's better than the rest. They all have extremely important implications for different people. So, um, when you are taking the test, if you take it, just make sure that you're taking it for you and not for someone else. And that's not to say that the values that like your parents have instilled in you might not be something that's really important to you. Like, I love my family so much. Like, family is one of my top values. But you also have to kind of reflect on where you're at in your own life, and not the things that other people expect from you. It's kind of just a stepping away from what society says, what your family says, what your friends say, and just really looking deep inside yourself to figure out what you say, what you think is most important to you. Because again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's all about just self-awareness and understanding yourself better. So if you do take this test, there's a couple things that you can kind of think about after you know your values. So, number one, sharing your values with others can help them to support you better. Because if they know what's important to you and why you act a certain way, then they're going to be able to show up in a way that's more authentic to you instead of only going off of their assumptions and their attitudes, which may not be the same as yours. So, as you're kind of reflecting on those core values, you also want to think about whether or not they mirror who you want to be. And one of the examples that I like to give is if one of my top values is family, but I treat my siblings like garbage, then obviously that value is not aligning with my behavior. So that tells me one of two things. I've either kind of strayed from that value and I need to really kind of lean back into it and make sure that it is important, or maybe that's not one of my core values, which again is totally fine. That's just it's going to be a personal reflection to figure out where you're at with that. Um and and the important thing to think about too is like these values could have very productive or unproductive outcomes with those behaviors, because like no one's going to say my number one value is hate or like anger or like anything like that. These are all things that are pretty central to just people in general, but there can also be things taken out of context or things taken to the extremes that might not be productive or healthy for you. So reflecting on kind of the way that your behavior currently is and if that is mirrored by those core values is going to make sure that you're seeing yourself in the way that you want to be seen and the way that you truly are acting. And sometimes it might require you to like ask other people, like tell them your values and say, do you see this in my life? Because if they are really important to you and you want them to be like super prominent, then it's probably important that you are checking in with those pretty regularly to see if that's being mirrored in your everyday life. um Another thing that really helped me, especially when I was kind of transitioning out of my career as a college athlete, was figuring out like what these core values are so that they can help you with your future career. Because in a lot of ways, those values that you take in you apply in sports or in relationships, you can probably very clearly see how that's going to translate into other areas of life, like in your career. So if service is one of your top values and maybe like sport was a great way for you to serve others, and if you're a Christian, maybe it was like a good way for you to share the gospel and just like love on others while you were playing, maybe you just think about how that can translate into a career. Like maybe you want to work for a nonprofit or do some kind of service oriented career like a nurse or a doctor or anything like that. Once you know those values, it's usually pretty clear to see how they're going to interact in all different areas of your life, because it's not just in sports and it's not just in work and it's not just in relationships, it's in all of the areas of your life. And so for me, to kind of reflect on that was really helpful when I was thinking about what was next for me, which can be a really hard transition for a lot of people. And sometimes we feel like we've lost our identity and we don't have anything else that really is like who we are to the same extent as being an athlete in whatever capacity. So understanding that those values are consistent across your life in every season helps you to apply it to something else and find some kind of fulfillment based on those values. So for me, it obviously is getting to talk to people. Authenticity is a really big value of mine. And it's, again, one of the values of authentic performance in general. And so you just kind of have to figure out where you're at and see how that applies to other areas of your life. And then the last thing that I recommend is just sharing this test with others, because you're also going to understand people better when you understand what they value. And I'll give this example that I've heard several times before. If you have two people working in any kind of job, we'll just say like a sales job, you've got two guys that are both kind of in a similar role at a company. And one guy he stays late most days. He wants to get as much done as he possibly can. So he's getting out of the office like 6:30, 7, maybe sometimes if there's extra work to be done. So that's where he's at with his position. He's going to put in the extra work because he knows, what needs to get done. You've got another guy who leaves every single day at exactly 5 o'clock. And if we don't know those people's values, the person who is staying later may start to get really frustrated with the guy who's leaving at 5 every day, because it's like, well, do you really care about, this job and what we're trying to do here and accomplish? But then if you were to sit down with those two, the one that's staying late every day might say, well, yeah, one of my number one values is achievement. I want to achieve, I want to grow, I want to do as much as I can. And this job is everything to me. Where this other guy may say, well, my number one value is family. And the reason why I leave every day at exactly 5 o'clock is because I want to go home and have dinner with my kids and put them to bed and spend some time with my wife before we go to bed and do it the next day. There's nothing wrong with either of those perspectives, but if they don't have that perspective of each other, then there can be some resentment or confusion or, miscommunication, where if they're just super authentic and real with what they value, then they can lean into what that means for each of them. And again, the guy that's leaving at 5, he might not be, as achievement oriented, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't really value his job. Maybe he just leans into more of the job as a way to support his family, and he is completely committed to that. So in that sense, like, that job means a lot to him too. But if we don't have these conversations, then we don't know. And then, relationships can have really hard, hard things that you have to work through because you didn't fully understand where the other person was coming from. So with that, again, I just want to remind you, this is a really good thing to just reflect on, think about. You can go online probably and find some more stuff on values, maybe some tests. But again, I've kind of adapted one that I took to maybe fit athletes, or it's not completely athletes, like just anyone who's looking to dive deeper into what these values mean. So please email me, DM us, and I'll send that over and you can get going on your values journey. So if you have any questions about values, I love talking about them. Again, our Instagram DMs are always open, email always available. So super excited to hear about what you learn about your values. Thank you so much for listening to Authentic Performance, the podcast. We would love to hear what you found valuable in this episode, so send us a DM on Instagram at Authentic Performance, or leave us a review on whatever platform you enjoy most. We want to thank you for your continued support of this project. It truly means the world. We also want to invite you to be a part of the Authentic Performance fam, so follow us on socials and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. For more information about how to get involved or to see how we're supporting athletes, go to theauthenticperformance.com. Finally, let us know what you want to hear on the podcast and who you want to hear from. We want to give you the best possible resources and support, and your feedback helps us do that. In the meantime, think about how you can live authentically. See you next time.